Welcome to the Australian Finance Podcast, a podcast for people who want to learn more about their personal finances and get the most from their money. This series is hosted by Kate Campbell from How to Money and Owen Raskovich from Rask Finance.
The Australian Finance Podcast is provided for educational purposes only. The information is general in nature and does not take into account your needs, goals, or objectives. What that means is the information does not apply to you specifically. So consider getting the advice of a licensed and trusted professional before acting on the information. Kate, welcome to the 8th episode of the Australian Finance Podcast.
Hi, Owen.
What are we talking about today?
Well, today we're going to dive into this topic of property, investing, owning for lifestyle reasons, and real estate investment trusts, which are another way to gain exposure to the Australian and global property and infrastructure market.
Cool. So everyone should be familiar with property.
The great Australian dream.
That's it. It is. And we've talked about this in passing a little bit. And just off air a moment ago, we were saying that this may be a slightly longer episode, but we expect to be relevant to everyone.
Yeah. Everyone's got to live somewhere.
So chances are in some way, shape or form, you have exposure to property. So I think this episode will benefit a lot of people.
Yeah.
So why don't we start off with why property? Is it a lifestyle asset? Is it an investment? Is it both? What do you think?
I think it can be both. A lot of people are buying property for all sorts of different reasons, whether that be somewhere they want to live, and they're buying it. There's emotion involved. They're buying a family home. They're buying their first apartment just so they have somewhere to live, or they're buying it as an investment and they're planning on renting it out to someone else.
That's the thing, right? Like you can use it in almost any different way, shape or form. There's no right or wrong answer necessarily, I guess. It depends on what you want from it. One of the things that we've become used to in Australia is, I would say, pretty good performance from property as an investment, but also from a homeowner's perspective. You talk to most baby boomers or people approaching or in retirement, and property has become probably their biggest asset. Yeah. And I think there are a few reasons which we'll touch on in a minute, but that can potentially lead people astray in terms of what their preconceptions are before they approach property, whether they're buyers, whether they're investors, etc. So I think it's important that we discuss that. But yeah, I think, from a lifestyle perspective, obviously we all have to live somewhere. Yeah. And in some respects that can be dictated by property prices. So you hear the arguments that negative gearers are ruining the property market for first home buyers, or baby boomers did this to millennials did that, and it's just there's a bit of tit for tat. But as we'll probably talk about, it may not necessarily be as black and white.
And there's a lot of suburbs now that young people are just completely outpriced of, so we're having to move further and further out.
Yeah, and I think there's some things here that this is the Instagram versus reality debate, right? Where you have, maybe if you do have to move out, you have to move out further. That's just the way it is. It's the way of the world, right? We live in a capitalistic world. And
your first home's probably not going to be that big McMansion you've been dreaming of. You might have to start with something quite small. And
yeah, that's right. We're not all, was it Caitlyn Jenner or whoever makes a lot of money from the Kardashians? Like we all can't be billionaires at 21 or whatever. It's just, is it Kylie? I think it's Kylie, actually.
Yeah, Kylie Jenner.
Yeah, Kylie Jenner. She's got it. Yeah, amazing. But we all can't be like that. We all can't have the big houses on the big hills with the pools and whatever. And sometimes we just have to adjust for that.
And for most people, that's not actually reality. So what you're seeing on Instagram is not reality in
any way,
cases.
shape, or form.
Yeah.
So
and I think so much of property, it's tied up in that big Australian dream. So it's really sort of part of our psyche in Australia, and it's seen as this huge accomplishment. So it's something that people are proud of. When they buy their first home, they're putting pictures up, they're telling their friends, there's a big party, co-workers, everyone's proud of you and excited for you. But if you just bought you spent that deposit and bought the same amount in shares, well, no one would care.
That's right. No one would notice. You wouldn't write about it on Facebook.
Yeah, you're not going to go, I just
share
bought
certificate.
$80,000 of an index fund. Yeah. And then, but everyone's really on your side when you buy property. So it can seem like that is the best way to go just because society sort of dictates that's a great thing to do.
Yeah, and we talked about this off air, that often because property has performed so well for people who perhaps aren't necessarily financially literate. So what I mean is They don't necessarily understand how shares work. They don't understand how any of the other types of investments work. Yet property has been done so well for them. The first thing they tell their kids is go and buy a property because that works.
Yeah.
You know, sample size of 1, it's worked for me, so therefore you should go and do it. And yes, it has worked, but there are reasons why that may not necessarily be the most appropriate thing for them to do.
And I think a lot of people really like property because it's something, it's easier to understand and you can actually touch it. You can stand on that piece of ground, land, and you can touch the house and it's there. Whereas some of the other types of investing, you're never going to be able to touch your share.
Well, that's it. Unless you truly, I'd say the one argument against that is that if you have shares in a company, some people perceive them to be like ideas and things on a computer screen. But if you think about, like, I own shares in Apple, for example. Yeah. And I can touch my Mac, I can touch my iPhone. Yeah. You can't see, this is a terrible podcast, but I'm touching these things right now. And the company that I own shares in builds part of this. But anyway, I digress. That's just another thing for another time. But you're right. You know, if you don't understand how those things work, then you can go up and you can take your hammer and you can put a new weatherboard on your shack that you just bought, and you can make improvements. You can see it, you can smell it. If it's depending on the place, you can smell it. You know, you can just the house comes alive for you. So it's not necessarily all investing, and it's not necessarily all about money, and it's not necessarily all about lifestyle. It's like the combination. So tell me, Kate, if you are buying a house, where would you put money if you're trying to save? I think this is like the question I get a lot is, if you're a first home buyer and you're trying to save up the 20% deposit so you don't have to pay lender's mortgage insurance, which we'll touch on later, where would you put that money? And where probably wouldn't you put that money?
I think if you're looking at quite a short time frame, in sort of anything less than a year or two, you're wanting to put it in just a high interest savings account, maybe even a term deposit, just to stop yourself touching it. But I don't know, I was having an argument with my dad the other day and he's like, oh yeah, you should be investing your house deposit. So I don't know. There's different opinions on that. Everyone has different ideas on what's a suitable time frame to actually get started with investing. And I think if you're looking at buying a house in the next few years, you should just be putting it away into a high interest savings account.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Really, I think I agree with you, right? But I'm going to bring up 2 stories. So the first one is that during the height of the crypto, Bitcoin thing, I heard a story from a friend of mine who said his sister-in-law was saving for a house, and his in-laws said, you should put your money in Bitcoin so that you can save your deposit faster. And this was like 2017, right? This is when Bitcoin was like $20,000. And it's now who knows what, but it's a lot less.
I think it was like 3,000.
Yeah, so crazy, right? And you think about that, and the reason why we say put it in a savings account or return deposit and not put it in shares, put it in an ETF, is because of this thing, volatility, right? And you don't want to be risking the money that you have put aside for your lifestyle, which is saving for the house. You don't want to put that in something that could just get sliced in half. And the reality is that even though shares and all these other things do well over a very long period of time, if you were to zoom into what it looks like on a day-to-day, month-to-month or year-to-year basis, the share market is actually incredibly risky. So even though we say, this is part ownership of Apple, if we touch our Apple iPhone or whatever, Apple shares could be 5% higher today than they were yesterday. They could be 10% lower. That's just the share market. So you don't want to be putting your $5,000 or your $10,000 that you saved in that, right?
Yeah.
And the other story I wanted to bring up is we touched on LMI, which is lender's mortgage insurance, in one of the episodes. Was that the debt?
Yeah, I think so.
Debt episode, yeah. And we talked about, and I said it's one of the riskiest things you don't have to pay. And I had a friend of mine who's pretty knowledgeable about property, and they said LMI is all right because if you can get in the market sooner, because if the market's getting away from you, the property market, you think prices are getting away from me. Prices in the suburb that I want to buy in are going up 10%, but my savings account's only getting 2%. I'm never going to get in, right?
Yeah.
So they say, well, maybe you can use LMI to get in the market sooner, and then you can capture some of that growth. And that's true. Like, we often get FOMO, the fear of missing out. And I think the thing there is that the market always feels like it's getting away from you, but it is cyclical. Property prices do go up, they do go down, they do go sideways for very long periods of time. So just keep saving, and you'll get there eventually. It's just one of those things you have to put up with.
Yeah, and I've met people that have financially stretched themselves to buy a house that's probably way out of their budget, but they've just really stretched themselves, and then they can get in a really bad situation if they do lose their job or anything like that because they're only just able to make the mortgage repayments. So it's better to be in a situation where you're more comfortable to actually pay for that house.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? And you're touching on something like mindset. It's about having the right attitude towards property. If this is the biggest thing you're ever going to do in your life financially, take your time.
Yeah.
Like, it's not, what's a year over 50 years?
Yeah.
Take your time. You might lose 5% this year. Like, you might fall behind, feel like you're falling behind. But longer term, for your sanity, for everything else, it's really important.
And most people are getting mortgages, like 30-year mortgages. It's a long period of your life. Like,
that's right.
A lot of time. And it's a lot of money you're putting on the line. So you want to make sure you've really financially prepared for this.
For sure. And it's a good habit to get into, saving money, right? That's what you got to do. So I just coined this, but the solutions podcast, not a problems podcast. We don't just identify all the problems with the world. We actually give you some solutions.
Yeah.
So if you are saving for a house, what are maybe some of the things that you might consider to get that deposit quicker?
Yeah, so some people do choose to get a second job or make some extra income on the side and put that money
Side hustle?
side hustle, take up some extra shifts if they're working a shift job, and put that money solely into their house deposit account. And a lot of people do have a separate bank account just for that house deposit, so they can really see the value going up and keep track of it that way. Yeah,
that's a really good one, I think. Side hustle. I've said before that I'd love to get a job at Bunnings on a Saturday and work, but I have no skills in any sort of trade, so like it wouldn't work. But
I think they hire high school students, so you're probably all right.
Oh, well, there we go. Maybe I could just be the cashier or whatever. But you could get a job, and even if it sounds, for some people it's like, oh my god, only a year. Well, if it's only a year, you could do that for a year, and you could put away extra $5,000 or $10,000, perhaps, maybe, know, and that's a huge way towards getting a deposit.
Yeah, and I guess it comes back to, as we've spoken before, your priorities. And is saving for a house a priority in your budget, or is going on the next big trip a priority? Everyone has different priorities, and if you've just got to work out how important and what your time frame is. Do you want to buy a house in 1 year, 5 years, and sort of adjust your budget accordingly so you can save up for it?
That's really important, right? Like having that time frame, knowing how much you're saving, and then using like a spreadsheet or whatever you want to do to say, I'll have this much in this amount of time, and that's when I'll probably be able to buy. And that's a really good way to do it, because you know what you got to do.
Yeah.
You don't have to stretch yourself too much, and you just put a time on it. So the other one we've got here is you could invest in yourself. So by that we mean upskilling,
further education, and there's so many free courses you can do online now, and just really improving your capability, so you can maybe get a pay rise or a better job or something like that.
Working towards promotion.
Yeah.
And this is something I'm sure we'll lecture on a few times throughout the series, is that there's a reason that we go to school at the beginning of our lives, is because that's when we want to learn the most, because then our knowledge compounds over time and we can then become more employable, and we can become smarter as time goes on.
But I mean, in today's workforce, it's lifelong learning. You've always got to be upskilling and improving yourself nowadays.
That's right. So, and if you can do little things now to get ahead and get a promotion, you'll probably find that savings come to you a lot sooner. A lot quicker, sorry. So the other thing is, before we round this section off, is just sometimes you don't have to buy a property straight away. People in your life, the amount of times people have said to me, have you bought a house? Have you bought a house? I think I was, this is going to show my age, so I apologize for everyone. I think I was around about 24, I'm going to say, and I had maybe $80,000 saved up, maybe.
So you're all ready to buy that house if you're 20%
I could have bought a house, right? I remember I was telling someone the other day, I could have used that money, and I could have gone and bought in the middle of nowhere, because this is the type of person I am. In the middle of nowhere, I could have gone and bought like 150 acres of bushland.
With a rabbit hutch.
With a rabbit hutch, yeah. Maybe there'd probably just be wild rabbits living in the ground. But the idea that was how I would spend my money. And people were like, no, you'd use that and buy a house in a suburb and all the rest of it. And I was like, nah, you know what? At the end of the time, I didn't go ahead with any of that. And I ended up just keeping my money invested in shares. And
that's the thing, you don't have to buy a house.
That's right.
There's other ways you can invest your money, which we will talk about many times throughout this series. But that's not the only option. If you're just buying it because you think you should, and you think that's the only way you should invest your money, then there's other options.
There is. And one thing with this is that I would never have been able to start a business if I had bought that house.
Yeah, because you do lock away a lot of.
That's right. It's that
your
optionality, right? If that $80,000 grew a fair bit before I decided to create my own business, but that's taking away the options that I had later on down the line. And I knew that there's another digression, but I could potentially use that money to invest in a business, which is probably a better investment than a property.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to property. Kate, I'm almost certain that property doubles every 7 years. Is that right?
Oh, I don't know.
Or is that every 7 minutes?
7 minutes. 7 minutes? 7 hours?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's every 7 minutes. So does it?
I don't think so, Owen.
Yeah, I think if you...
Maybe Bitcoin does.
Maybe, yeah. I think our minds, our monkey brains are always so susceptible to different biases, and one of the ones that we have is recency bias. Recency bias is the idea that because it's happened recently that it's going to happen again, and that's the commonly accepted truth. So since the 1990s, in the early 1990s, Australian property prices have gone through the roof. Literally, like, it's been crazy. And it's the longest time on record that anywhere in the world that the country has gone without a recession. And so if you think about that, you'd probably say that we're the exception, not the rule.
Yeah.
And unless we have some sort of, like, Australia's pretty awesome, let's be honest, but unless we have some sort of, I don't know, some magic wand that's been waved over us that says that we're going to go on forever and prices are going to keep going the way they are, there's a very good chance that it's not going to happen. And the simple laws of mathematics would tell us that every 7 years, if property doubled every 7 years, we would be well out of the market. We would have been out of the market many years ago. No one would be buying houses because it's just not possible, because all the other things that we do with our money can't sustain that.
Yeah.
We often talk about things like a time recession, which is effectively, instead of prices falling, because in Australia we have a good amount of population growth. Yeah. Instead of prices falling, house prices might just stay flat for a while. And
it could be 5 years.
That's right. It doesn't have to be, forever. It could be 5 years. It could be 3 years. So there's this belief, and this comes back to that mindset again, is that property doubles every 7 years is probably not the right one to carry with you through life. There are a few studies done in the US, and one of them was by Professor Robert Schiller, who did a study going back over 100 years. And he did it not just in the US, worldwide, and found that in actual fact, property prices barely grow above inflation. So that's that cost of living. And the only reason, necessarily why they probably would is supply-demand imbalance, and it's a structural supply-demand imbalance. We have that in Australia, so you could maybe expect house prices to grow a little bit more than that, but definitely not to double every 7 years.
And there's many areas in Australia where when people have bought properties where there was mining booms and things, they've dramatically gone backwards. So
that's right.
If you'd thought you were going to get doubling every 7 years, you would be in for a big surprise.
If you go over to somewhere in WA, tell them that property doubles every 7 years, you'd probably get thrown out of town. Yeah. So there were some numbers that I wanted to throw at that. So the idea that since the 1990s, Australian prices have done really well, and there's the three big things that I wanted to do, and these numbers were relevant as of 2018. So in this time, since the early 90s till 2018, interest rates have fallen from 17% to 1.5. So I think that's the late 80s to 1.5, 17% to 1.5 last year. Migration and population have gone through the roof. So we've gone from 17 million Australians to over 24 million. So that's a 47% increase in beds that you need to have. So roofs over people's heads. And in that time, we've also seen wages increase from $450 per week. This is average or median wages, to over $1,100. Yeah. So it's a 260% increase in that time. So if you think that wages are still going to grow at 200 and whatever percent, or you think that Australia's population is still going to grow in percentage terms, the rate of growth in the same way, or you think that, our wages, once again, wages are going to grow, population's going to grow, interest rates are going to keep falling from 1.5% to, who knows, negative maybe, well, you'd want to check your numbers before you would rely on that. So don't go pawn your kidney and buy a house just based on the assumption it's going to grow at 7.5% or 10% per year forever. Okay. We got through that one. Kate, what are the three typical options someone would have if they're buying a house or a home, I should say?
Yeah, so sort of in options, you've got apartments, houses, and units. And they're quite different in themselves, because when you have a house, you've usually got a piece of land as well.
Yep.
When you're buying an apartment, you're fractional owner of a bit of the land, but it's really the body corporate.
Mm-hmm. What's a body corporate?
So sometimes they can be a bit of a pain. I've had a few horror stories from colleagues, but if you're in an apartment block with 1,000 apartments, then someone has to make decisions on when renovations are made, when painting's done.
Mm-hmm.
And usually each apartment owner will pay a set fee, whether that be $1,000, $10,000 to the body corporate each year.
Yep.
To pay for those common costs. And like new apartments with pools and everything, the body corporate fee has to pay for those, the pools, the cleaning, everything like that. And then sometimes it can be run by an external company who take a fee for collecting the cash and administering the body corporate, or it might be run by if it's sometimes a smaller apartment block, the tenants, so they'll have a body corporate.
I think we should just say that outside of Victoria, these are often called strata.
Okay.
Strata titles and strata apartments and all the rest of it. So in Victoria, we call it a body corp. I have experience with these types of organisations, and they're not pretty. For example, our apartment got broken into a few weeks ago, and we don't have cameras where this was broken into. This is a common area. This is I shouldn't say our apartment, but like our storage facility.
Yeah.
And a fair few $1,000s worth of stuff is stolen. And it turns out that there are about 5 other thefts over the last month, and they've all been lodged with police, but there are still no cameras there because what's happened is no one in the building wants to have a meeting with the Body Corp, who's an independent company, and say, can we put in security cameras? And the Body Corp doesn't want to do that because it costs money.
Yeah.
Right? And so you have this issue where we have an apartment where we're not necessarily sure that our belongings are safe.
Yeah.
And it's almost like we're powerless against that. So obviously there's some issues there that people need to consider. And one thing that I get a lot is people go, I'm going to buy a house in XYZ suburb. Oh, look, I can't afford a house in XYZ suburb. Therefore, I'll buy an apartment somewhere else.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, it's a concession that they've made. They've gone, okay, well, we'll just go and buy an apartment. Not realizing that there are so many headaches that can come with apartments and things that have...
And body corporate fee is probably something you haven't factored into your...
That's right. But I'll give you an absolute figure. So let's say that you have an apartment and you might rent it for $350, say. It wouldn't surprise me if you're paying $50 a week in body corp fees, sometimes more. So if you factor that in, you go to your mortgage, you're like, this is how much it's going to cost me to buy this place. This is how much I could rent it for. This is what I'm going to have to assign to body corp. All of a sudden, it becomes an unviable thing to do. So you have to be really careful with that. But you also have to be really careful. These body corps, and you can ask to inspect the books before you buy one of these, like an apartment or whatever. But sometimes on the books of the body corp, there are debts and liabilities that you, as an owner coming in, may be liable for. So you need to be careful about that.
So just because it's got a nice fancy pool and gym, there could be a lot of costs involved with the body corporate for that.
So if you look around and you see that the place has an apartment, a lift, that's going to be more expensive than a place that doesn't have a lift.
Yeah.
If you look around, it's got a pool, it's going to be more expensive. If it's got beautifully manicured garden, it's going to be more expensive. So these are all things that you need to take into account when you're looking at apartments, not just the price tag, but what's the ongoing cost. And for me, as someone who's a finance person and probably a bit tighter than average, it doesn't make sense for me to be buying something that then I'm going to have to pay more money for to maintain. Okay, so I reached out to a friend of mine to get some facts and figures about the difference between houses, which everyone knows what a house is in like a middle income suburb, versus apartments and the prices. And in Australia, you can Google it, that ABS statistics, attached dwellings versus detached dwellings. And I think it was since 2003, houses tend to outperform slightly, but more recently, during a slight, you could say, correction in property prices, we've seen that houses have pulled away again from units and apartments. And my fundamental belief is that a lot of the value of owning a house comes from the land, not from the building, because that's obviously an asset which can be replaced or pulled down or whatever. It's actually the land location. Those are the things that make the property, I suppose, unique. So when you're considering, what might be the best financially, you might want to consider, if it's apartment, what makes it more viable longer term than spending a little bit more versus a house. Now, Kate, you and I live in a very similar suburb, just in inner suburbs of Melbourne, you could say.
Yeah.
Would you ever be tempted to buy something off the plan, like an apartment off the plan?
I don't think so.
No.
Personally, I don't have buying property in my sort of immediate future.
Okay. Now, can you imagine why buying something off the plan? Like, I get the impression that you're not a big property investor, but can you imagine why buying off the plan would be risky?
Oh, I mean, they have very glossy brochures and
Yeah,
nice
they do.
showrooms, but there's a lot of risks in between when you put your 10% or so deposit down and then when the apartment's actually built.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's right.
And there's usually maybe 4 years between them, and a lot can happen. The projects almost always run over budget,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes there can be pretty nasty legal battles as well, depending on if the developer goes bust in the meantime and all sorts of things. So
For sure. You and I, like I said, we live near each other, and I could probably count off the top of my head maybe between half a dozen and a dozen apartment buildings that are going up in
Yeah.
our area. So what happens is when you buy off the plan, effectively your money is you're reserving a spot in the development, right? But then could be 300 other apartments that are in that development. So you need to be sure that that's going to go ahead before you put your money
Yeah.
down, which might not. And like you said, there could be cost overruns. The developer could cut corners.
And they can have some pretty nasty legal clauses if the project takes longer than X amount of years. The developer can sort of kick you off and all sorts of things. I've heard a few horror stories.
So it's just crazy, right? And then once you get to the development being complete, what happens is what people underestimate is they think, oh, the developer said I'll buy it for this amount, and then in 18 months it will be worth this much, or estimated to be worth this much. I'll just sell it and make a profit, right?
Yep.
Which is kind of crazy, because what happens is in an apartment building or complex, if you have, say, 50 apartments, there's so little differentiating each individual apartment. And what will happen is if the builder or the developer can't get enough sales of apartments, they'll fund the apartments themselves, or they'll find some way to fund it. And then they'll just flood the market as soon as the development's complete and sell those apartments to try and realize some profit.
So you're competing with multiple other
That's
sellers
right.
to sell the same kind of thing.
You sell exactly the same box in exactly the same suburb. And the problem that you have is that in our example, in our location here in Melbourne, that you have a dozen other apartment buildings that people can choose from. That doesn't necessarily mean that prices are going to fall or collapse, but it means that the rate of growth in your investment in that apartment will be a lot less than if you just bought a house in a unique location. So something to consider. I would say just blacklist. If you're thinking about buying an apartment off the plan, blacklist it. If you've already bought one, I'm sorry to have to tell you. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the things that a would-be homeowner, or some of the people that a would-be homeowner might interact with. So who are we talking about?
So the salespeople, so the real estate agents. So they're going to, in most cases, some people do it privately, but you're going to be dealing with the real estate agents when you want to buy a house, and they're going to be telling you all the wonderful things about that house and the glazed windows and the mud brick walls, and they're going to be, so they're working for the seller because that's where they're going to get their commission from, but they're also trying to get the best price. So they've also got to sell the buyer, so you've got to be sold on the product. So they're really salespeople, aren't they?
They are. At the end of the day, they are, and they make a healthy clip from from people spending the most money probably in their life. Unless you're buying yachts or airplanes, houses are probably up there with the most lavish things you can afford. So
they're only going to tell you the good things about the property. So it's up to you. You have to do your own due diligence, and whether that be getting the place inspected. I know sometimes people have to do termite inspections on older houses and things like that.
Yep, really important.
But you need to make sure you know all the flaws in that property, because they're not going to tell you about it.
That's right. And one of the ways you can do that is you can read something called the Section 32. Now, I should have done some Googling, but I don't know if this is just a Melbourne thing or a Victorian thing, but a Section 32 is effectively the official document which sets out all the limitations and important information for that property. Yeah. So there'd probably be a similar document in different states, but in Victoria we call it the Section 32. Have a read of it. I mean, if you're spending $500,000 on a house, or $200,000 or $1 million, I mean, it's worth the hour that it takes to read that document. So, and if you don't understand it, you can contact a solicitor, conveyancer, whoever, find an expert that can decipher that thing for you, because that's the most important one. So an example might be someone buys a house and they don't know that there's a storm water drain under the ground at the back of the property. So they thought, I'll just develop this and put 2 units on, or we'll put a pool back there. No, because there's a giant pit just beneath that. So that's the kind of document that would tell you that.
Yeah, and what are the council restrictions on the land? They might not let you develop it. And there might be heritage restrictions on that house too. So there's rules on what you can and can't do if you want to renovate.
That's right. So that's the document that you can do your due diligence, as we say. The other one is, we've talked about it just before, is just the strata or body corp. If you are inclined to buy an apartment for, say, income purposes, just read the body corp, get the information on the strata title.
Yeah, what have the historical annual fees been? That's
right. Know what the financial position is of the body corporate. You don't want to take responsibility for someone's debts or mismanagement.
Yeah.
These people that run body corps are often, they're not always lawyers or accountants or people that are financial literate.
Yeah.
And you don't want to be responsible for that.
And you may also be dealing with a mortgage broker.
Oh, yes, mortgage brokers. Yes.
So you might be going to them to help find the best rate or the most suitable home loan option for you. So you've got most people don't have 100% of the money required to buy the house. So they'll have their 20% deposit and they'll need to get a loan from a financial institution to fund the rest.
Yeah, so they might get a 100% mortgage on a house. No, definitely don't get a 100% mortgage on a house.
Is that possible?
Yeah, well, probably if you get a guarantor from just say a young person doesn't have a cent to their name and they go to the bank of mum and dad and they're like, hey, can you just be a guarantor for me? No.
Yeah, so you might be using a mortgage broker to help you find the best home loan rate that's suitable for you at the time. And they sometimes have access to home loans that don't work directly with retail customers. So there's some institutions that only work through mortgage brokers. And then there's some smaller companies that you might not hear about. You probably only think of the big financial institutions, but there's over 30.
That'd be heaps. Yeah, I don't know.
There's heaps of companies that offer home loans. So often a mortgage broker can assist you with finding something. You've always got to work out what's in it for them. Are you paying a fee? If you're not paying them a fee to do it, then where are they getting their money from? Usually they get a cut from whoever you get the home loan with, and maybe just find out if there's any agreements they have with them.
Obviously, being in finance, I've had to deal with like licensing and a lot of regulation that we have to go through in the industry. And I wrote this thing. And I said, don't use a mortgage broker because of X, Y, and Z. And then I had all these compliance and legal people reach out to me and say, you're wrong. This is, you need to say this and this and this and this.
Well, mortgage brokers do increase competition in the marketplace.
So there are good things, right? But I'm the no commission, only work for the end user. No one should ever come between the client and the service that they need. That's my stance on everything, right? Never. And
you're willing to put in the hours required to search through every single mortgage loan provider.
Well, this is the thing. In the time that since then, we've had the Royal Commission, and it's been found that mortgage brokers are often not working in the client's best interest, or if they are, it's not done in the most appropriate fashion, and it's done for them to drive commission. So at the time, when I presented my evidence to this compliance person when they came back to me, I said, well, hey, mortgage brokers on average earn $142,000 a year. The financial advice industry transitioned away from that a long time ago. And anyway, this is a property podcast, but I think if you should ask your mortgage broker for if they are fee for service. And that means stumping up the cash up front to pay them on an hourly rate. Yeah. Or, there are, until these new rules come in, there are mortgage brokers out there that will refund the ongoing commission to you. So that's effectively, like, I'm not talking about a bit of money. I'm talking about, like, they're going to give you $1,500 a year, which they would normally take for a $500,000 mortgage, say, and they're going to put that into your mortgage for you. Yeah. And that's going to have a huge impact on how quickly you can repay your loan versus them paying that, they're taking that and whatever. Yeah. So find a mortgage broker that can compare the options, as you're saying, increase competition, but also work for you. Yeah. First and foremost. So that's my rant. If there's any questions on that, I'm sure there will be a fair bit of feedback to that one. Let us know. Okay, so Kate, I'm a property buyer. Yeah. And I found a property that I love on realestate.com or Domain or whatever. and there's an auction this weekend. Who is that auction for me or is that?
The auction's designed to get the best price for the seller.
Yeah.
So it's not really not designed for you, but they'll make it fun. They'll make it exciting. Everyone will be gathered outside the front of the house, and there'll be an auctioneer yelling really fast, trying to get the price up as high as possible above. And there'll be a reserve, so there'll be a minimum price that the seller's willing to sell the house at. And then they'll often tell you once they hit the reserve. And then it can get pretty crazy. So I think the enthusiasm's died down a little bit recently, but there was some pretty crazy auctions and multiple parties just bidding, trying to outdo each other because they just like the property or they got sort of swirled up in the madness of the auction.
Yeah. And the thing is, there are a lot of opinions on this, right?
Yeah.
Whether you should or you shouldn't buy at auction or whatever. But it's just one of those things. Like, the seller is incentivized to get the most money for their property.
Yeah.
And you, as the buyer, don't want to do that. You want to do the opposite of that. People get really emotional about this stuff, which we'll get to in a minute. But my advice is that if you know what your budget is, just submit your offer before the auction. And there's no rules to say necessarily that you can't do that. Just call the agent and say, I will offer this amount of money based on, there being no pests and building inspection, etc. And then if you don't get it, you don't get it. I'm afraid to say that if you, with your best offer, can't get it, then you shouldn't have bought it.
Yeah.
And this is the thing. A lot of the people that buy property let other people tell them how much something's worth.
Yeah.
That's the opposite. Like, I don't go to the share market and be like, oh, look, Combank shares are $70 today. That must be what they're worth.
Yeah.
If I know what I'm doing, I'm going to figure out how much they're worth and I'm going to wait for that price. And so
I guess auctions can bring out that competitive streak. You might go $100,000 over budget just because you want to beat that person standing across from you in the room.
That's it. And there are people that you can use to give you some guidance here. There are buyer's agents, which we talked about. There are, people that know what they're doing. You can rely on family and friends to give you some counsel here. It's just one of those things that it's designed for the seller, not for the buyer.
Yeah.
So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, the only reason they go to the whole effort of putting on an auction is they think they'll get a better price, really.
That's right, yeah.
Otherwise, there's no point in having an auction.
That's right. They wouldn't do it otherwise.
Just direct sale.
And we're recording, we don't want to timestamp this, but we're in 2019 when we're recording this, and there is some change afoot we're experiencing right now, and that could be a sign that auctions may not necessarily be the best place for sellers to sell. So there may be opportunities for buyers going forward. And so we just talked about, I talked about how it's important to know your limits. One of the ways that you can know your limits is when you go onto a borrowing power calculator, one of the things you do is you put in your income and you go, wow, look how much money I can borrow.
Yeah, and the bank says they'll loan you $1 million.
Yes, and you might have an income of $42,000 and you're like, wow, that's incredible. So basically it comes back to two different things, and it comes back to your earning power and the interest rate of the mortgage. And if you put in an income that's unrealistic, well, you're going to get whatever figure you want. And if the interest rate that you're paying is very low, then you're going to be able to borrow more.
Yeah. And everyone will be encouraging you to borrow more. The bank will.
Oh, of course.
Sometimes the mortgage broker might be pushing you to borrow more.
Oh, they get better commission for. Yeah, this comes back to commission.
And even the sort of real estate agency will just going, just put up your price a bit more and you'll be able to get it.
Didn't you see 2 McGovern Street sold for this amount? This one must be worth more.
Yeah, and your friends will probably be saying, oh, you just get in. It doesn't matter if you pay an extra $100,000 or so.
Something crazy. So my tips with this calculator is interest rates are very low at the moment, but they won't be like this forever.
Yeah.
I would say put it in an interest rate of something like 7.5%, regardless of what the loan says they will offer you right now, because you've got to prepare yourself that may be the reality.
And if you're committing to a 30-year loan time frame, you need to be able to be prepared for interest rates to go up.
Yeah. And another rule of thumb that I have is try and keep the mortgage repayments less than 30% of your income, because this comes back to our budgeting episode where we talked about having the right amount, so you can put it aside and you can still invest and you can do all the rest of it. And that can be pretty revealing.
And you might just have to adjust your expectations, as I mentioned earlier. You might have to start with something small, like a 1 or 2 bedroom instead of a 5-bedroom house, and in a further out suburb than what you wanted, and then slowly work your way in.
Sometimes we just need to check ourselves and know what's achievable and what's just simply not.
Yeah.
One of the things that has come to light recently is this thing called rent vesting. Do you know what that is?
Not too much.
Okay, so rent vesting is this idea that you buy in a suburb out a bit further, or where you don't want to live, and you rent where you do want to live.
Yeah.
I was, being myself, I was initially skeptical of this. I was like, why would you even do that in the first place? But it can work.
Yeah.
You can actually buy in a suburb that you think is going to go up in price. It might be a cheaper one when they're doing new developments or whatever.
Yeah.
And you do a bit of research and you realize, hey, I can afford a house there, but I don't want to live there. You can do it so that you move into that house for a limited amount of time. You get the first home buyer's grant, whatever. And then you move from there and you go and rent in the place that you like. And your rent can cover the mortgage on that property. The rent that you receive can cover the...
Yeah.
Too many rents flying around, but yeah, you get the idea. So... Like you can definitely do that. So that's one way around that. I don't want to live in that suburb. It's way too far out. It's not very nice. Blah, 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 blah. You can talk to, say, an accountant who can explain the differences between what might be tax deductible and what might not be. And then you can sort of figure out where you can afford to buy and where you can afford to rent. And there's some great blogs online too called, there's like rent vesting blogs, they call it. So it's worth looking into if you're in that position. Yeah, something that I would even consider doing, to be honest. I don't own property. We've had some questions on that, but I don't own property. So it's something to consider. And one last thing before we get to some other accounting tricks is offsets versus regular accounts. Did we talk about offset accounts?
I think we did in sort of the saving episode maybe.
Yeah, so offset accounts are a really good one. If you own a home, you can get with the right bank. You shouldn't have to pay for it, I don't think.
Yeah. Just
talk to the bank about getting an offset account, or you can even talk to your accountant about potential savings that you can get from having an offset account. So in effect, an offset account, if you have a mortgage, may be able to
reduce the interest you pay.
Which in effect is better than you would receive from a savings account.
Yeah. And I know some people do keep their emergency funds in their offset accounts, as long as you're able to easily transfer money in and out of it with no fees. Yeah,
that's a good one. And then, very good one. And another one is redraw facilities, which is when you pay ahead. I think we talked about that in the bank accounts episode. What is this? Do you know much about negative gearing? We won't go into it in too deep.
I mean, it's definitely been a topic of contention at the moment.
Yeah, it's so there's a really good book, and I've got it right here on the bench once again. Great podcast material. There's a book called Inside Real Estate. It's written by a guy called Peter O'Malley. He's an Australian guy. I think he's from the northern beaches of Sydney. And there's so many good books, but this is just one of them. And it really just opens your eyes to the tricks and traps of the industry.
Yeah.
And one of the things is that, and this is something that I believe, is that if you have an investment, it should be cash flow positive. So that, we hear a lot about negative gearing, and it's effectively where the interest that you pay on your mortgage for an investment doesn't exceeds the rent.
Yeah.
So then you're actually going backwards.
Yeah. So you're losing money.
That's right. And the ultimate goal is that you hope that the price of the property increases beyond the amount of interest that you'll pay, or the negative gearing that you'll use to sustain that property as part of your portfolio, quote unquote. But the issue with negative gearing, I think, comes when property markets aren't going up, which happens, as we've talked about.
Yeah.
It doesn't always happen in Australia that often, but when property prices stagnate or they go sideways, we have a time recession, or properties go backwards, negative gearing can catch a lot of people out. So I went to some inspections recently, and recently property prices have been going backwards, and half of the people that were renting the properties, we talked to the real estate agents, were the owners.
Yeah.
So what they were doing is they were worried about their mortgage repayments because they've been negatively geared, or they've just bought them. They may not all be negatively geared, but what they're doing is they're realizing that the repayments have suddenly caught up with, where their mortgage is, and they need to make decisions. So the easiest way to avoid, I think, getting caught out with any of these tricks that people have in the property industry is just to make sure that whatever you buy, it's making money.
Yeah.
So it's after stamp duty, body corp, etc.
Yeah, and I think don't make decisions solely based on one tax incentive, because the government can change the goalposts at any time.
Oh yeah.
They can change the rules. It's their rules. So just don't make decisions solely on that without factoring anything else into account.
Absolutely. And also we should say, don't make a decision based on only one podcast episode that you hear.
Yes.
This is a big thing in your life. So you probably want to talk to accountants
or just one news article you read. I've heard some people recently planning big changes to their personal finances just because they've read a couple of articles and they haven't really gone any deeper than that. So
we're just giving you the basics. This is a very emotional thing. It's a very
Yeah, and you're
powerful
dealing with a
thing.
massive asset.
That's
So
right.
you want to talk to qualified professionals such as accountants.
Yeah, accountants are the best ones for tax-related questions. Okay, so the other, just rounding out the types of people that you might encounter, solicitors, really good if you're a property investor to have a good solicitor.
Yeah. And they'll be involved with the buying and the selling of the property.
Yeah, so we have conveyancers or people that help you get in and out of properties. One thing, if you're trying to sell a property, it's probably a good idea to sell your property before you buy a new one.
Yeah.
And one thing, if you're moving into state or you're moving to a new suburb, is just try renting in that suburb for a year before you buy.
Yeah.
You might not like it. You might hate it. And you might think, geez, that was a mistake. And all of a sudden you've got a $500,000 asset in a mistake.
Yeah.
Like, don't do that. Just maintain that optionality. And when you are selling, what's maybe a good trick that people might be able to do with agents? Do you know? Oh, throwing you a curveball. So just ask maybe 3 real estate agents for their prices.
Yeah.
And often the agents that overpromise underdeliver.
Yeah.
So if they say it's worth $750,000 and you go with them and then there is no buyer in that range, then the property can sit online for a while, in advertorials for a while. And all of a sudden you're lowering your price, and that can be a sign to potential buyers that there's something wrong with the property, you're desperate, etc.
Well, they'll wonder why it's sitting on the market for so long.
Yeah, so this Peter O'Malley's book, this Inside Real Estate, is a really good one. It has some good statistics about pricing the property right. That's probably the most important decision. So that means not just going with the guy with the biggest smile or the lady with the best suit. Actually, their job is to flatter you, but at the end of the day, unless they can back up their claims, it's get 3 agents to give you a quote.
And I think another important thing to know about property is it's a lot less liquid than other investment options. So essentially, I think as someone I know used to say, if you need cash, you can't just sell the bathroom or the garage off of the property. You have to sell the whole thing. And that can take many months, especially if the market changes. It's not just an up market. You might struggle to find a buyer at a reasonable price, or you might have to sell it at a price lower than what you bought it for, which is a worst case scenario.
Yes.
So it locks up a lot of your capital, and it's hard to get that money out quickly if you need it. So that's one thing to take into account, and that's why it's so important to have that emergency fund.
Absolutely, all those things. And you touched on something there, which is emergency fund.
Yeah.
Is that when people buy houses, often they use their emergency fund to buy the house. That can be very risky, because if you have, say, $40,000 saved up for a house, and then you dip into your $10,000 emergency fund just to get the deposit over the line, you buy your biggest asset, all of a sudden you need to furnish it, you need to do all the rest of it.
Yeah, insurance,
and
body
you don't
corporate,
have anything.
all those sort of things.
So you've got no emergency savings, and then you're all of a sudden on the hook for more bills.
Yeah, and it's always going to be more expensive than you think. And there's so many, like, what if the plumbing breaks or anything like that? You've got to pay. There's all these hidden expenses with properties.
Maintenance.
Yeah.
Yep. Anyway, we don't want to be too pro or too negative on property and too pro shares or anything else, but what are the ways that you can identify a spruiker? So someone that is trying to scam you.
Yeah. I guess that's one issue in the property industry is there's a lot of people trying to sell you courses and properties and all sorts of weird and wonderful things, or developments. That's another big thing.
Yes, it is.
Are they calling and emailing you excessively? Are they promising you a return that doesn't mention the risks, or a return that's out of this world, and that a return that doesn't line up with anything else happening in Australia at the moment? Like, these are just insane.
That's great. That's a good one. They don't even mention the risks.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're just purely salespeople.
And they're like, this is the next big thing. There's nothing that could go wrong. You're guaranteed 100% return on your investment. I mean,
Ponzi scheme. But yeah, we'll get to some of those schemes later on. But
and sometimes it's not a scheme, but it's not going to be anywhere near what they promise, and they're just selling you this big story.
Yeah. I think the last one that I had on this list is just, and if they could say that they're from the ATO, or they can do something with the ATO, as in like they can promise you a tax refund or something, just run a mile away and speak to your accountant.
Because the ATO on their website have any tax incentive is listed on the ATO website, and you can actually go and verify these claims for yourself.
And there's sometimes, I know there is definitely on the ATO website, there's like a scam page, like the thing where they're phishing emails and all that sort of things, all those types of things that they pretend that they're from the ATO. I think it was a podcast rule. I don't know if I made this up, but if they call you and they put you on the spot, don't give away any information to no one. If they have to call you to pitch you something, just don't.
And if they're giving you a free ticket to this full day seminar, watch out.
Yeah, that's right. If there's a table at the back of the room at the seminar that you have to like sign into or give some sort of information, just no. No, that's bad.
I mean, I saw once when I was going on holidays in Queensland, they would give you a free TV if you came on this tour of their developments. And
free TV.
Yeah.
Cool.
I mean, I think they would be using pretty aggressive sales techniques.
Oh, for sure. Okay, so this is all pretty negative. Let's say if we want to be pro-property and we want to buy property, but let's say we're starting out.
Yep.
There's one trick or one way that we can do that with as little as $500, right?
Yeah.
And how do you do that?
So there's a way to gain exposure to both Australia and global property and infrastructure without actually having to buy the physical property. So you can invest in a Australian real estate investment trust. So a little bit similar to ETFs, so the exchange traded funds we've talked about previously. There's sort of an actively managed product that's listed on the stock exchange in most cases, and you can buy it through your broker, and they'll be invested in infrastructure. They might be invested in car parks, Australian office blocks, supermarkets, those big shopping centres, and you can buy sort of a unit or two, and then you get exposure to that without having to buy the property. And that's a lot more liquid. There are fees involved. They're probably a little bit higher than exchange traded funds generally, just because there's more management involved. And obviously they're having to pay all of the stamp duty and all the tax and everything like that. But it does give you a way to expose yourself to property and infrastructure without having to buy a house.
That's right. So to summarize that, you can just use a normal share broking account. Instead of having to pay like $30,000 for a deposit or whatever, you can just take your $500 and you can buy a part of what we call a REIT or REIT, it's all capitalized.
Yep.
And you can buy into businesses that that operate property. So things like if you go through the CBD and you see all the big towers and all the big apartment buildings, maybe not apartment buildings, but the big like, office towers, they're owned by someone.
Yeah. And
they're not typically owned by any individual. They're owned by what we call a REIT.
Yeah.
And so you can buy part of that using the share market. And you get, it's similar to dividends. You get something like a dividend or like a rent. So you benefit from all those things just like a normal investor, but you can do it with like $500. And that's a really good way if you do think, Australian property is good right now, whatever, or you could go invest in like a one that's
if you like Australian
overseas.
property but don't actually need to buy a house or an apartment right now, then that's a way you can invest in it.
This isn't a buy or sell recommendation. We don't do that on this show, but there are two, and this is to bring it home for people. There's one that invests in Bunnings warehouses, so it owns the actual Bunnings stores.
Yeah.
So there's the company that owns Bunnings and runs them, but then there's a REIT that owns the building and the land.
Yeah.
So you can buy into that. Or there's another one that is Westfield Shopping Centres. So you could own the business which owns the Westfield, the building.
Yeah.
So not the business, but the building, and then get rent from all those retail outlets.
Yeah, and often these REITs will give you a distribution of the rent received from their tenants.
So like every 6 months.
Yeah. So instead of getting the rent in your bank every month, you might just get a quarterly or twice yearly distribution.
Yeah. So it's kind of like a check in the mail.
Yeah. So you can we'll put some links on sort of websites where you can find more information on REITs and what they are and how they work, but it's just an option to consider.
Yeah, that's it. Okay. So we've covered so much in this podcast.
Yeah.
What are some of the action points, Kate?
I think firstly, if you're interested in property, work out why you're buying it. Is it just because you think you should, you want a house to live in, you want an investment, and then sort of start from there. I think just start saving. If you want to make sure you can have that 20% deposit. And so sometimes that might take you many years, but start now so you're ready for when you are ready to buy. And also read as much as you can. So we'll put the links to some books, but get independent advice and read as much as you can, and even go to different auctions and different inspections in the area just to know what's happening in that area where you want to buy and have an understanding of what the prices are.
Other things is when you do save, it's boring, but save in a savings account or somewhere like that. We'll get an expert on to talk about the super scheme that's available, which may not be available in the near future. So we'll talk more about that in a later date. When you use a mortgage calculator, don't just go with what the bank says. Don't go with what the mortgage broker says. Do what's right for you. Try and keep those repayments below 30%.
And also learn about the different players in the industry, what their incentives are, where they stand, and if they may be suitable for your situation, where you can find them.
Yeah, what are they trying to do? What's their incentive?
Yeah. So
one thing I'll add is that one of my rules of thumb, another one, is just to own a property for 7 years. So plan to own it for 7 years. Yeah. And that's just to ride out what we call before that volatility, the random ups and downs.
Yeah.
And then to also remember that property doesn't double every 7 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And if you receive a call from someone who promises that they're working with the ATO and they've just got this really good new deal for you, Kate, what do you say?
Thank you, next.
Yeah, thank you, next. Yep, good one. I like it. Okay, so anything else you want to add?
I think that's probably enough for today's episode, but we'll put heaps of resources in the show notes. So if you are interested, you can go and explore from there.
Mm-hmm. And questions?
If you have any questions at all, please get in contact us. I'm on Twitter at HowToMoneyAustralia.
Mm-hmm. You're online as well?
Yes, www.howtomoney.online, and feel free to contact Owen or myself if you have any questions at all.
Yep, I'm at Owen Rask, it's RASK on Twitter, and the raskfinance.com website where you can lodge a question, and we'll have some show notes there too.
All right, well, thanks for staying with us today.
Yeah, thanks for the longer episode, and love to hear feedback.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, see you next week.
Thanks, Kate.